Build One South Africa co-founder and Member of Parliament Nobuntu Hlazo-Webster joins me in studio for a broader conversation on women in politics and business. Nobuntu, thank you so much for joining us, and a happy Women's Day to you.
Happy Women's Day to you too, Masa. Thank you for having me.
What's the right thing to do? Should I be calling you honorable? Are you used to it yet?
Getting used to it, to it.
I'll stick to Nobuntu Hlazo-Webster for this interview for now. Right? You just heard the president of the country as well speaking there at a Women's Day celebration in the Northern Cape. What do you make of these annual Women's Day celebrations that government has? Earlier, we also saw the Eastern Cape Premier, Oscar Mabuyane, also speaking. And he was speaking about the teenage pregnancies that we've been seeing coming out of that province too, but just saying it should stop.
So I think, you know, year after year, we do this. We commemorate Women's Day. We raise the challenges. We talk about the challenges. I was in an interview earlier this week when a woman caller called in and said, you know, actually, we're tired. We're tired of having the conversation because we feel like things aren't changing. And I think, you know, your question as it pertains to government is that we need to be locking down more on reviewing legislation and policies that exist and whether they are sufficient, whether they are doing enough, and if they are not, reviewing them and looking at how do we make sure that we have stronger legislation, policies that will see us having a difference and seeing a difference in the economic participation of women, in the safety of women, as well as actually in women being in leadership, even in politics.
Yeah, and you have an extensive career path in the business sector as well, you know, also having been the chairperson of the Businesswomen's Association of South Africa, having been the president of the youth arm of the International Women's Forum. Now, that's a highly prestigious as well networking organization for businesswomen too. Why move to politics?
Look, everything I've ever been doing, you know, even in my own businesses, my businesses, ultimately, one of my businesses was in economic development consulting, and that was about how do we start to see transformation in the economy? You know, how do we start to see ownership in the economy? So everything I've ever done, even my participation and leadership in those organizations, has been about my contribution to change in South Africa. You know, I've been involved with various NPOs throughout my life, and that has always been about how do I contribute to South Africa. But a time came where that felt like it wasn't enough. You know, it felt like, you know, you can do things from the fringes, but there's a need to be able to get our hands dirty. I always say that nobody's coming to save us. There's a sense that, you know, let's do what we can on the fringes and see somebody will do something. But the truth is, I don't know who we're waiting for. We've got to be the ones in South Africa as South Africans who say, let's contribute to changing our country. If you lead in South Africa, if you contribute in South Africa, you are qualified, you know, and credible enough to be able to lead in public leadership and in governance in this country.
Now, I know it's only been a couple of weeks, but have you been able to get in and see how you're able to get your hands dirty, how you're able to make that difference from a public sector perspective and not from the private sector?
No, absolutely. You know, some of the conversations we're having now, we're having a conversation, for instance, about the safety of women. Yeah. And part of what we've championed at Build One SA is making sure that we are fighting the cause to have the National Sex Offenders Register be public. Because while there are interventions, they're not enough that are looking at the aftermath of gender-based violence. We need to look at the preventative measures, and that's one of them. In Parliament, there's opportunity, and it is a platform to be able to drive the economic advancement of women. I sit on the Trade and Industry Portfolio Committee. Now, there was a commitment from government announced by the president for procurement of 40% towards women businesses, but we're sitting at less than 5% as it stands now. And so those are the things that we have to have oversight over in Parliament. Those are the issues that we have to drive in Parliament so that we start to see a difference. So absolutely, I have seen and I have started making my own contributions in terms of how do we start to see change, particularly in the economic transformation. And as Bill Bwana say, we had always said we are about putting a job in every home. And so there are various policies that we are driving in parliaments, one of those being the township economy. I'm particularly passionate about that because even as you see women participating in the economy, they participate in the informal economy. Only about 20% of businesses in the formal SME sector are owned by women. But when you go to the informal sector, you see women are participating there. But how do you then start to accelerate what they are doing? How do you start to multiply it? How do you start to grow it? And the township economy and having policies and funding for the township economy is an opportunity to do that.
You know, earlier when you were mentioning a listener or a viewer who had said, you know, we are tired. I think it's a sentiment shared by many South African women as well, especially when it comes to a day like today. And we're seeing our officials and our public representatives saying the right things, but they're repeating the things that they have been saying for many, many years. And when you talk about the National Sex Offenders Register, there's been a huge cry from, you know, the NPO, NGO space calling on government to say that we need to make this public. Now that you are inside, you're saying you're already making these calls from within. Do you think realistically that we will be able to achieve this?
It's something we've got to fight. It's something that we have to work with those NPOs that have started championing that cause, with other various stakeholders. But also, I think one of the important things is about the unity of women. As women, we have to start speaking with a united voice. We have to organize ourselves better. It has to go beyond racial lines. It has to go beyond political lines. The women of 1956 did exactly that. They were there. It didn't matter if you were a professional. It didn't matter if you were working class. It didn't matter if you were a housewife. There were women there from all different persuasions. And they were there to say, in a unified voice, we are saying not on our watch, not in our name. And that's what we've got to do as women. And that even pertains, even speaking beyond issues like the one you raise of the sexual offenders register, even issues of women leadership, you know, having legitimate leadership in the public space, having legitimate leadership of women in politics. What that takes is women uniting and saying, we get behind these women who we believe will represent us legitimately. Because we have over 40% representation of women in parliament, but that has got to translate to benefit the women of this country and to benefit society as a whole.
Yeah, how does it make its way down to grassroots level?
Absolutely.
You co-founded African Pursuit, and you said part of this was that you wanted to commercialize dreams. Now, you've mentioned as well the portfolio committee that you're part of, the DTI. I also know that you're part of the small business department portfolio committee as well, and your passion being in township economy. Are you then able to commercialize dreams the way you were doing it in the private sector where you are now?
I mean, it's very different. Now there is a collective, there's a collective outcome that you want to see. You want to see an outcome that benefits society as a whole, that benefits a nation. And, you know, in a business, I was working with various corporate companies, making sure that we are able to invest in businesses that are small, in businesses that can actually grow in South Africa and on the continent. This now is about saying, how do we make sure that we use a larger source, which is investment from government into townships, into businesses, to say, how do we then start to grow that sector? How do we start to grow the small business sector? How do we start to grow the township economy? So it's the same thing, but different, in that while the influence may have been at a smaller scale, this means that you're able to potentially have influence at a larger scale. And I always say that as it stands in South Africa, with the level of unemployment that we have, with the economy as it is, we have a constrained economy. We cannot expect the mainstream economy now to be able to create the jobs that we need. And so we have to expand the economy. And that means looking at investing strongly in small businesses, looking at investing strongly in the township economy.
And these kinds of thoughts and suggestions and sentiment, how has that been received in Parliament? And now that you are a newbie there?
So these have been presented in Parliament, they've been presented in committees, they've been presented in debates. We then have now in the second term of Parliament questions that we will be tabling to the various portfolios. And so now we'll start to be getting responses and to be hearing how those are being received. But the reality is that this is an agenda that I'm going to drive continuously. And in receiving answers to questions as well, it is also about knowing exactly what input is needed. Because you may find there is some work that's been done, but there is still some contribution that can be done. But that's when we'll see how it's been received. But one thing that is for sure is that I remain committed to driving that cause. Mm.
How difficult will it be when you consider, I mean, I made mention of, and these are different spheres of government, I'm talking on a provincial level now when I was speaking of the Eastern Cape Premier and how he was remarking on those, they're actually child pregnancy stats, because if we're looking at the 10 to 14 gap, those are children, you know, and lamenting on it to say that, look, this needs to stop. We need to tell young boys to stop. We need to tell young men to stop. If it was as simple as saying stop, I'm sure it would have stopped by now.
Absolutely. This is statutory rape that is taking place. And it needs to be dealt with in that way. It needs to be dealt with the weight that a crime such as that should be dealt with. So I think there are various issues that we need to look at. First of all, we need to look at awareness and education. Parents, communities, and children need to understand what consent is. They need to understand what statutory rape is. But then additional to that, when it comes to SAPS, when it comes to the official crime prevention that needs to take place, when it comes to law enforcement that needs to take place, we need to be seeing better training, we need to be seeing better skills that are enabled to be able to take care of cases such as that. Because the reality is that crimes are taking place and we're not dealing with them like the crimes that they are. And actually, most of the time, families and children themselves aren't aware that these are crimes that are taking place.
So obviously more needs to be done. And the president speaking in the Northern Cape as well, just saying, you know, we have come a long way, which is absolutely true since 1956, but saying, you know, women now can vote and women now can work. Don't you think in 2024 we should be saying something else by now? The fact that women can vote, that is a no-brainer and it goes without saying. But shouldn't we be talking about what women have achieved and what government has been able to foster for women to achieve in the past 2, 3, or 4, 5 years?
Absolutely. We can't be comparing 2024 to 1956. We have to be comparing 2024 to 1994. And when you look at the numbers, the changes are so small. For instance, over the past 10 years, when you look at the number of women that sit as executive directors on JSE-listed companies, it's 27%. When you look at executive managers that sit on listed companies and state-owned enterprises across the board, the average is about 29%. When you look at the fact that the face of poverty is a woman, when you look at the gender pay gap, when you look at the fact that women often, when we say women are employed, they are in lower positions than men. When you look at those issues, we should definitely be further along. And I maintain that the reason we are not is that we are not looking at the impact of legislation, and we are not reviewing legislation and policy when it is not giving the desired outcome.
And that's also only the half of it. Then we have a gender-based violence problem, a huge, huge issue. And I remember in 2019, after the rape and murder of Uyinene, there was a huge uproar and women marched in the city of Tshwane, women marched in Cape Town to Parliament. The president came out, received the memorandum and made some promises too. You know, stricter sentencing for men found guilty of rape and murder of women. Also saying that police stations will be a safer space for women to report such crimes as well. And as you and I know, that hasn't been the case for many women who enter a police station and try and report gender-based violence. What more can we do from government's perspective to try and fight the scourge that we're facing?
You know, you mentioned Uyinene, and I want to ask you, you know Uyinene's name. Do you know the name of her perpetrator? do you remember the name of Uyinene's perpetrator? Chances are not. Many South Africans will remember Uyinene's name, but not the name of the perpetrator. So I could meet Uyinene's perpetrator. I could hire him, I could work with him. I could have an intimate relationship with that person and not know who they are. That's why the importance of the sexual offenders register being made public and accessible cannot be underscored enough. That's one of the ways that we have to look at in order to be able to prevent the furtherance of the scourge of gender-based violence. There's other ways. We have to professionalize the police force, law enforcement, when it comes to the issue of gender-based violence. We have to have specialized skills. We have to make sure that in police stations, it is safe for women to be able to report issues of gender-based violence. We have to look at the issue of corruption that takes place within the law enforcement system, because people are able to pay their way out of crimes, including violent attacks, including gender-based violence. We have to look at the issue of specialized courts, because women are even scared to go to court because that doesn't feel safe. And so these are a number of interventions, and as Bildwane say, we actually included them in our manifesto as interventions that have to be looked at. And those are the kinds of things that we can bring to portfolio committees in Parliament to say, let's make sure that we are tabling these as interventions to end gender-based violence. We've also spoken about provincial task teams, because while we're speaking about the issue at a national level, and we're not decentralizing it, we're not dealing with the dynamics of each province, and we're not dealing with what happens in each and every police station case by case, then we will never get to the bottom of the issue of gender-based violence.
Nobuntu Hlazo-Webster, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to let you go on and enjoy the rest of your Women's Day, or what's left of it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming through.